Welcome, everyone. This is Jordan, and I'm the worship pastor here at Trevecca Community Church, and we are so glad that you're here with us today as we hear God's Word. Each week, we stream the service live from the sanctuary just for you. So come along with us now as we grow together and hear what God has to say to us.
Our scripture this morning is found in the book of Amos, chapter 8. This is what the Lord God showed me, a basket of summer fruit. He said, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a basket of summer fruit. Then the Lord said to me, the end has come upon my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The songs of the temple shall become wailings on that day, says the Lord God. The dead bodies shall be many, cast out in every place. Be silent. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the ephah smaller and the shekel heavier, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who lives in it, and all of it rise like the Nile, and be tossed about and sink again like the Nile of Egypt? This is the word of the Lord.
That is decades of pastoral experience to make that text sound that calm. Thank you, Pastor Randy. And I love having kids hear the word of the Lord, but there are some Sundays it's like, yeah, let's dismiss the kids now and then read the text. The piles of dead bodies and those kinds of things, it's just, there's some Sundays, and that's an okay thing. Good morning, friends. I greet you in the name of the Lord. My name is Tim. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus. This week, I have been digging around in Amos, and it's caused me to start thinking about the way organizations run. And I mean the way organizations really run. Do you all have those experiences of associating with an organization where someone has their name on the door, but you all know who's really running the place? You know what I'm talking about? I know your stories, many of you well enough to know, some of you are working in organizations where there might be technically a CEO in place, but you know whose world you're really living in. Does that make any sense? This week, I got an email from the drama boosters at our kids' school. And they were requesting that I come to the school and take pictures of the kids to get ready for the program that you all get when you come and see the production, the spring production that our kids are going to put on. I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do this. Let me just contact the director and find a good time for her that I might come in and take pictures of the kids. And the email that came back to me was basically, oh, don't bother. We all know who really runs this place. Kind of a thing. You don't need to clear this with the director. You can clear this with the boosters. That's the way the world really works. You all know whose world you're really living in. And in many ways, that is the fury of the question that is burning underneath Amos. See, the passage that Pastor Randy just so calmly read for us is a passage where there is a lot of angst underneath it, asking the question primarily, whose world are we really living in? Whose world is actually shaping this whole thing? Now, this is a question that is still landing on us in a lot of ways today, but let me give you a little backstory on how the story of Amos, I think, is actually asking the question of whose world we're really living in. At the time that Amos was writing, he's writing to the people of Israel. The people of Israel are primarily identified as the worshipers of Yahweh. But at the time that Israel is living and the ancient kind of Near Eastern world, there's lots of different organizations, there's lots of different nations and civilizations around them that all have different gods. And for the sake of simplicity this morning, I'm simply going to refer to those collections of gods or that god as Baal. They all worship Baal, and the people of Israel worship Yahweh. Now, Baal is the god of productivity, the god of fertility, the god who can get some stuff done. And the basic idea here is that if you can produce enough for Baal, Baal will produce enough for you. The question is, are we really living in Baal's world? And so part of what happens is that Israel comes along and they worship Yahweh, the God who isn't going to just demand that you produce enough to be able to make that God happy enough. See, Baal's the God who can provide all the things that ancient civilizations in the ancient Near Eastern world needed. If you needed crops and you needed kids, and by the way, everybody did need crops and kids in the ancient Near Eastern world, you needed Baal on your side. And you needed to produce enough for Baal that Baal would produce enough for you. The challenge is that that's just not the way that Israel's God worked. Israel's God is the God of grace. Israel's God is the one who was providing for the people in love and care, even though Israel isn't necessarily providing anything back for that God. Israel is the one who worships the God who looks at a people who are held in slavery and captivity and says, even though they aren't producing anything necessarily for me, I have a holy purpose for this people, and I'm going to work until they are free so that they can fulfill this holy purpose as my covenant people, and they will go out into the wilderness, and the first thing that they start asking about when they get into the wilderness is, what are we going to eat and drink out here? What do we produce out here? There's not enough for us to have out here, and God provides for them manna, which literally translated means something like, huh? What is this stuff? I don't know what this is. The general idea here is that manna is something that Israel, the people, did not produce. God gives it to them. And it says something to us about the character of this God. I love the idea that manna is this basically a question word, because I don't think it's just about what is this substance. I think it's a kind of confusion. This is something that was just given to us, that we didn't have to produce. It didn't come out of the sweat and toil. It was just handed over to us. What kind of a God would do this? We don't understand the character of a God who just provides enough for people. And so the question, I think, behind Amos is, whose world are we really living in? Are we living in Baal's world, where you have to produce enough to be able to get that God to produce for you? Or are we living in Yahweh's world, where Yahweh is going to provide for the people who Yahweh cares about, who Yahweh loves, who this God cares for? There are over 90 instances in the Old Testament of the people of God somehow facing down Baal. Probably one of the most famous is in 1 Kings 18. This is the story that many of you probably know, the story of Elijah, this great prophet who goes to battle on the top of Mount Carmel. If you go to Mount Carmel today in Israel, you will still see this great big statue that's been put up of the prophet Elijah. He's kind of standing up there with his sword victoriously held in the air over the prophets of Baal. And maybe some of you remember the story. The prophets of Baal are going to have this showdown with the prophet of Yahweh. And these priests are going to call down fire. And so they put all the stuff together, and they're begging Baal to provide the fire. And what does Elisha do? What does Elijah do? Elijah says, let's go get some wood, but I want you to douse it in water. Let's soak this water. And many of you know the way that the story goes, that even though they've doused it with water, there's this fire that descends upon this. And I want to be really clear that this is so much more than just like the Super Bowl of the gods. This is not just about like Team Yahweh versus Team Baal, and like which one of these is going to come out on top. This is really a question of whose world are we living in? Who's really running this place? According to what patterns is this world actually going to be run? And the notion here is that if you have to produce for Baal, that productivity is going to be the way that the world runs. But the people of Israel are the people who are telling a different story. and being set up to be God's holy people as a way of speaking back to all of the other nations, that's not actually whose world we're living in. The Lord God calls Israel into existence, I think, as a resistance to that story. In essence, Israel's life is meant to show the rest of the world whose world we're really living in. Israel's finally going to be the people who demonstrate that we're living in Yahweh's world and that our needs are going to be met. That anyone who comes along and tells you that the world is run for the sake of productivity has simply got the story wrong. And how is Israel going to do that? How are they going to proclaim this week after week after week? By Sabbath. Now, friends, if you're just joining us this week, we are concluding this week with a sermon series over the last several weeks about Sabbath. We've been doing this through the season of Lent, and you may know that Lent is the season in the church's life where we place a lot of attention and energy on examining just really what is driving our lives. Lent is a season where we turn toward the cross of Christ. We look ahead to Good Friday, and we look ahead to Easter, and we turn our faces toward the cross, and we ask ourselves, what is it about my life right now that needs to be laid down for the sake of following faithfully after the way of the cross? What is it that needs to be maybe picked up for the sake of following after in the way of the cross? What needs to change about my life? What do I need to fast, or what do I need to pick up that I might be a more faithful follower of Jesus on the way to the cross? And in many ways, someone like Amos is a good friend to us along the Lenten journey. Why? Because Amos belongs to a group of biblical writers known as the prophets. And the prophets did a lot of things, but one of the things that they were best at was calling the people of Israel to lay down certain things and to pick up other things that they might be God's faithful and holy people. The prophets are really good at reminding us that there is a holy purpose for the people and that they have work to do in the world, and that work is going to require some faithfulness. And so in a season like Lent, people like Amos, I think, are a good friend to us. Amos was telling the people, reminding the people, you have a holy purpose to remind the rest of the world whose world you're really living in. And so Amos comes along at a time when Israel is, I think, struggling with Sabbath. And here's why that's a problem. Sabbath is the primary way that the people of Israel are different from the rest of all those other Baal worshipers. Or we could put it like this. Sabbath was the way that Israel showed the nations whose world that they're really living in. It's as if the practice of Sabbath was the way that Israel could proclaim to the rest of the nations, look, this life isn't just about endless productivity. It's not about forever fertility. It's not about us working hard enough to please this God, that this God might give us the stuff that we needed. We live in a different world. That is not the world that we actually live in. And this is one of the ways that I think that Israel could maintain covenant with God. See, when God told the people that they're going to be a holy people, that they were meant for a purpose in that holiness. Their purpose was to show everyone around them whose world they were really living in. And they were going to do it through Sabbath. Sabbath showed everyone that we are living in God's world and that God cares enough to provide for our needs. In short, Sabbath is the way that Israel resisted the temptation to live as if this is Baal's world. And then came the trouble. See, the prophets are also really good at reminding the people when they're really in trouble. Israel started messing around with Sabbath. And according to the passage that we've heard this morning, Israel was all about practicing the Sabbath, but there was a contingent of people in Israel who were doing something like, technically practicing the Sabbath with one eye on the clock. Basically saying, when is this thing going to be over? We know the way the world really works. The way the world really works is that you have to produce a lot of stuff. You're supposed to be a really productive person. And yes, okay, we're going to practice Sabbath because we're God's holy people, but I can't wait until this thing's over. We've got about 14 hours until I can get back to productivity. 6 more hours until I can get back to all of the work of productivity. And it's almost as if the people are starting to say, we know whose world we really live in. We're really living in Baal's world, but we're just going to act for a little bit of time like we still live in God's world. And what made matters worse is that they're producing and selling in ways that landed really heavily on the poor. In Amos 8, we get the picture of what was really going on and what was being called out by the prophet: cheating on weights and measurements, engaging in deceptive practices. So that when someone barely had enough, and this is a fairly common practice, when you barely had enough, and you were bringing what you had to market to be able to use that to get the things that you needed for life, part of what the deceptive practices is like putting your thumb on the scale that the people who barely had enough weren't going to get everything that they deserved for what they were bringing to barter and to trade. So in other words, non-Sabbath living lands most heavily on the poor. The Baalistic kinds of ways of living life is going to victimize the people who have the least. And part of what Sabbath is supposed to do is to form the imagination of a people that said, there is enough and we're going to live like there is enough, so that even the people who have the least still have enough to be able to live. I got to be honest with you that throughout this series on Sabbath, one of the tensions that has made me uncomfortable over time is just how deeply unsabbathed we are as a society. Because we're talking about things like taking a break from work and stopping production, and yet at the very same time, I know that there are people in our church for whom that is just such a far away reality. This isn't just about like taking a break. This is about, how am I going to make rent this month? How am I going to put food on the table? Could I really actually take a Sabbath? Because if I do what you're suggesting here, there isn't going to be enough at the end of the month for me to be able to survive. And I get that. That is a reality. But that is a reality that tells me that we are probably more likely living in a Baalistic world than we are in a Sabbath world. In a Sabbath world, the reality is that we are supposed to be able to have enough. There's supposed to be enough for everybody to go around, and we don't do practices like weighting the scales to harm the people who have the least. And this is what Amos ends up saying is really the reason for Israel's downfall. I know the passage that we read this morning had a lot of harsh words in it, and in many ways, that's the power of a passage. Amos isn't going to pull any punches because of how serious this is. This is why he's willing to use such harsh language. It's as if he's saying, you not only forgot who you are, but you completely forgot your purpose. You're supposed to be reminding the rest of the world whose world we really live in. We really live in Yahweh's world. But you're just watching the clock, and you can't wait to get back to Baal's world. In other words, you've kind of got one foot in the Sabbath practices, and technically you're going to do that, but oh, how you are resisting the resistance. You see, Sabbath was Israel's active resistance against Baal's world. It was the active practice of saying, we are resisting that story. We are resisting that story that would tell us that this is whose world we're really living in. And what Amos looks at and sees is a group of people who are resisting the resistance. Yeah, okay, we'll technically do it, but gosh, I can't wait till we get back. And when we get back, oh baby, are we going to produce? We're going to produce, in fact, at even the expense of the poor. I think Israel's primary problem here is that they might be practicing the Sabbath. They might have the Sabbath, but the Sabbath doesn't have them. Israel has learned to resist the resistance. If the Sabbath was the way that they resisted the lie that this is Baal's world, then they'd grown a thick skin and resisted what the Sabbath would actually do with them as God's people. They're resisting the resistance. God's people lose their distinctive edge when they learn to resist the resistance. Some of you know that I'm a pretty big Trekkie. I will never forget the first time that I saw an episode of Star Trek. And it just pains me, the fact that Jacob and Kristen are with his family this morning, far away, because most Sunday mornings, I get a very good report from Jacob and Kristen on how much Star Trek they've watched the previous week. I've been walking with them on a journey of discipleship where they have been forming their son Teddy Even so much so that Teddy gets very excited when he hears the Star Trek theme song, and I just think nothing better could be taking place in the cultural imagination of a young boy's life. I mean, this is just a really, really good thing. Congratulations to Jacob and Kristen. They finished The Next Generation, and they've now moved on to Deep Space Nine. Congratulations. Huge, huge turning point in their life. I'll never forget. I was about 8 years old, and I saw, for the first time, the image of the Starship Enterprise on the television screen, and it was glorious. I mean, it was amazing to see this majestic ship flying through the stars, and there's this music that's playing, and then as you begin to watch the series, you begin to see what's really going on here. You've got this intrepid group of explorers who are relying on all of their ingenuity and creativity and teamwork and togetherness to solve all of the galaxy's problems. They're exploring, and they're learning new kinds of things, and they're using all of their power to be able to do that, and they're working together, and it's this incredible vision of the future. Even though they are coming up against all of these challenges and maybe even some villains, they can use their ingenuity to be able to defeat these challenges and these villains. And it's just wonderful. And then I remember watching as Star Trek introduced what I still think is the greatest villain in all of science fiction history, the Borg. The Borg. You all know the Borg, maybe. If you don't, let me introduce you to the Borg, these creepy folks. And here's what makes the Borg, I think, the best villain in science fiction history. The Borg aren't just creepy because they are cyborg zombies, and they are cyborg zombies. They're like former human beings who have been assimilated into the Borg collective and basically turned into half human, half machines, and so they're really off-putting and creepy. But what makes them even more terrifying is that unlike all of the other villains of science fiction, they don't just want to kill you. They want to assimilate you. They want to make you into them. They want to turn you, this lively, kind of thoughtful, good people, into drones with no personality who are on a mission to assimilate the entire galaxy. And I will never forget watching that first episode when they fly this giant Borg cube, this gigantic spaceship that's really the spaceship that dwarfs the Enterprise. And you think like, oh my goodness, the Enterprise might actually fail against this giant Borg cube because it can repair itself as it flies and all these other kinds of things. This might actually be the villain that defeats our heroes. And what makes it so creepy is that when they burst onto the view screen of the bridge of the Enterprise, you don't just see one of them. You see a whole collective inside of the spaceship. And together, in one voice, they all say, "We are the Borg. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." That's terrifying. If you're not creeped out enough, go watch some of these episodes because it is so scary when they all look at you and say, even if you resist, it doesn't matter. We are too powerful. We are too strong. We are too big. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. You can do anything you can to push back. It's not going to make any difference. It is pointless for you to resist because we are that big and we are that strong and we are that powerful. Can I suggest to you that the Borg are just as creepy to us as, and maybe even creepier, at least in Israel's time, to all the other nations around the world who also wanted to assimilate Israel. I want us to have the Borg in mind when we're thinking about the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the people who would come from Persia to conquer Israel. In many ways, they're marching in, and they are big, and they are strong, and they are powerful, and they have all of the possibility of conquering us, and they're coming along saying, "You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. There's nothing you can do. You don't have an army that's big enough. You can't produce enough. You don't call on Baal enough to be able to resist the power of this. Everything you do is not going to be enough to resist us and the power of who we are." But the crew of the Enterprise resisted. And the people of Israel resisted, just in very different ways. The people of Israel resisted with everything that they had, and Amos calls on them to continue to resist. How? By Sabbath. Sabbath is the resistance. Sabbath is the way that we don't get assimilated, because the idea is that if we can just assimilate into the culture here, what will you become? You'll become a good producer who is convinced that you have to produce enough to please this God, that God might give you the things that you need. Israel's over here saying, that's not the world that we live in. Sabbath is our resistance against this. Sabbath is the way that we say we're really living in Yahweh's world, and Yahweh is the God who provides enough and cares for us. We don't have to produce to please this God. We can live a joyful and a full and a holy life because this is our God. He's the one who's really running the world, not Baal. That's all a lie. But what do you do when the people start to resist the resistance? If Sabbath is the resistance, what do you do with the people who said, well, we're going to fudge with this just a little bit. We're going to play like we technically adhere to the Sabbath, but we've always got 2 feet in the Sabbath and 1 eye on the clock. Is this thing almost over yet? We almost done with Sabbath? Can we get back to the production for just a little while? Friends, Sabbath is how we affirm that resistance isn't futile. Sabbath is the way that Israel resisted becoming assimilated into the cultures around them. Sabbath was the way that Israel didn't disappear into Baalism. It was the way that they not only maintained their distinctiveness, but that their purpose as a people, their holiness, was maintained. If they were to simply assimilate and disappear, who would be left to remind the world that this is Yahweh's world? Can I make a suggestion? Sabbath is more than a practice. Sabbath is more than a command, and I'm going to really make a very ginger suggestion. Sabbath is more than just a personal reset day, okay? It's more than just a personal recharge day. It's more than just a day to kind of sit on the back porch and do what you want to do. Sabbath is our resistance against being assimilated into a vision that says this isn't really God's world. Sabbath is our pushback against what I'm going to call contemporary Baalism, that tells us that the world that we're living in really is Baal's world. We may not call it Baal today, but we've got all kinds of other names for it. That's I think, the problem that Amos is speaking against. He's looking at a group of people who are technically observing the Sabbath while also counting down the minutes until they can start taking advantage of the poor, until they can start making a buck again, until they can really start technically worshiping Baal with their lives. If the Sabbath is their way of resisting the assimilation, this is a group of people who's learned how to resist the resistance. Now, please hear me. I'm also talking to myself when I say this. When we resist the Sabbath, we're basically conceding that we aren't really living in God's world. That's the problem here. When we resist the Sabbath, it's a silent confession that what really makes the world work is production, fertility, Baal. We may be fine to have both feet in the Sabbath, but we also want to have 1 eye on the clock, waiting until we can get back to what really matters. And Sabbath is the practice that calls us back to holiness. It reminds us that God created the real world. And every time we resist the resistance, every time we skirt the practice, we're largely saying something like, well, these practices are good and all, but we've got to live in the real world. And in the real world, I've got to go get all this stuff done. In the real world, I've got to be involved in all of these things. In the real world, I've got to prove my productivity to be able to make God happy. And every time we do this, I fear that we are resisting the resistance. And saying a little bit every time in that resistance, God didn't really create the world. This isn't really God's world. Do you hear what I'm saying in this? I have to say this to you a little bit confessionally because some of you know on the Strengths Finder, you get those top 5. Whew, that's a trip. When that comes back, wow. You start to see some stuff about yourself. Some of it, you're like, oh, I really like this. And others, my number 1 is achiever. I love getting stuff done. And people who are really versed in the strengths will tell me, that's not just what you're good at, this is also a love language. And so if you want your loved ones around you to love you well, they need to know your top 5 strengths and help you into all of those strengths. And so loved ones, help me achieve. Help me do all of the things. I love getting stuff done, but here I think is the problem. Oh, we love to humble brag about how we are bad at the Sabbath. You know what I'm talking about? I was in a conversation this last week with a pastor friend of mine, asking what's going on at the church. I said, oh, we're walking through the Lenten series on Sabbath right now. And the pastor just looks right back at me and says, you know what? I'm just so bad at the Sabbath. I am terrible at the Sabbath. I'm just so bad. As if to say, in some ways, like, this is a confession that I want to make to you as a kind of spiritual friend. But also, I think we know the code. That's kind of a humble brag. I'm so bad at the Sabbath. Why? Because I'm so good at getting it done. I am just so productive. I am so productive. Man, I've got this ministry going, and I've got this thing going, and I just preached this awesome sermon, and I'm doing all these things. And I am looking at my friend, and my friend's looking at me, and we're kind of realizing, this is really terrifying. We both have the same disease. So I'm coming to you confessionally saying this to myself as much as I am to anyone else. Isn't it the case that when we humble brag about how bad we are at the Sabbath, aren't we actually saying to the world, Baal's really in charge? That's a problem for the church. That's a problem for us. This is a Lenten practice for us that we might need to examine and lay some stuff down. Let me jump ahead just a couple of hundred years, or a few hundred years, into Israel's history. Several generations after Amos was done writing this text, there was a man who came to the capital city of Jerusalem. And he was surrounded by some friends, and he went into the city to the cheers of probably a small crowd. I mean, there were some people there, but there was probably not an entire stoppage of the city's work that day. A man from Galilee made his way to Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. And everything about that scene would have been laughable to people who are watching it with an eye to what's going on in the real world. It would have been awfully easy to dismiss him, I think, as living in a fantasy, to say that he wasn't living in the real world. There were probably plenty of folks that day who thought that he was playing dress up and pretending that a donkey was a magnificent war horse, and they dismissed him as not living in the real world. But the folks who only saw a ridiculous farce that day were probably also the ones who were living under the conviction that producers rule the real world. They may not have called the production Baal, but they had other names for it: Caesar, war, violence, national greatness, economic domination. How could you ever look at a peasant carpenter from a backwoods town who ate with the wrong kinds of people and see him as the one who is not only defining the real world, but setting the world right according to his life? How can we develop a trust and vision that God really is making the world new according to the way of Jesus and not according to the way of the producers? How can we ever trust that the way that the world is being redeemed is happening according to the pattern of a cross? How will we ever truly trust that Baal is a lie? It takes resistance. It takes Sabbath. And it takes us not resisting the resistance. Friends, Sabbath is a practice that will give us a vision for being the church in a profoundly new way. Sabbath is a practice that will allow us to see Jesus as the way and the truth and the life, especially on a Palm Sunday. Sabbath will help us resist being assimilated into a vision of the church as just another wing of the empire that's running errands for the world. This week, I'm so glad the way this all worked out. It just so happened, because I teach some theology up the hill at the university. And it just so happened that this week was the week that we had planned in our syllabus to talk about the church. It's a wing of theology known as ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is a fancy way of saying the study of the church. We look at what the church is, the mission of the church, what makes the church the church. And we had some delightful conversation in our classes this week. We started looking at the most difficult tasks that the church has in front of it. And we had to have some very difficult conversation, I think, to finally start helping students recognize, how do I say this? I say it with every bit of love in my heart for the church, that we have been infected with a disease where we have been resisting the resistance because we really do believe deep in our bones that we live in Baal's world. So one of the most difficult tasks in that conversation with students, I think, is to help them move from a vision of church that is functional Baalism to a vision of the church that can joyfully live in the pattern of Jesus on Palm Sunday. In many ways, I'm glad that we get to talk about ecclesiology the way that it all worked out during Lent, because there are just some visions of the church that are more at home with Baal than with the God of Jesus Christ. And we need God's help to turn away from those things. Church is not just about production. Our life together as Christians is not just making enough that we might please God, that God might give us more. Our life as the church is to be God's holy people who live squarely in the conviction that we live in God's world and that God will produce enough so that we can take a break from the production, not just as a means of recharging the battery so we can go do it more. As a living witness to the rest of the world, we live in God's world. Friends, if we resist the resistance, who will tell the rest of the world whose world this really is? That's why my passion is being renewed these days for raising up a generation of church leaders who will operate and call the church with that vision. The more we talked about these dynamics, the more I've come to realize that a large part of what we are doing is to prepare students to pastor people who have become really good at resisting the resistance. I think even we pastors are maybe some of the worst offenders of this. We love to humble brag about how bad we are at Sabbath, all the while silently proclaiming that this is Baal's world. Church might be a part of our life, but what really matters is production. And somehow we've lived under the lie long enough that if it's going to be, it's up to me. And so the hardest part of all this will probably be helping young pastors to develop a conviction that Sabbath needs to get us so that we don't get assimilated into the Baalism that's on every side of us. It's to help them form a people who abide in a deep trust that this is God's world and we're going to live like it. It's helping them to shape a people who aren't formed to say, yeah, I'll go to church, but I just can't wait. How much longer? Till we can get back to the production of this thing. We finished that class on Friday, and Allison and I had a wonderful conversation on the way over to the cafeteria. Allison, thank you for the conversation we got to have. Something was sparked in Allison's imagination out of that. She said, can I talk to you? I want to talk to you about some practices that I had to do in another one of my classes at the university, which is to take a social convention and to defy that social convention. So what did Allison do? She decided that she was going to stand up in the cafeteria and not sit at a chair, and it started to really freak some people out. Would you sit down? Can I get you a chair? No, I'm fine. I would just like to stand while I eat. This is really bizarre. People couldn't eat in peace because she was defying the social convention of sitting down at the cafeteria. And so we were walking on the bottom floor of the religion building up here, and we kind of walked past the elevator, and she said, you know what this is? It's kind of like walking into an elevator, and you know how everyone walks into an elevator and they immediately turn around and they face the door. I want to walk into an elevator, and I want to stand face the back wall and just look face to face at the rest of the people in the elevator. How strange is that? And then Allison said something that is just going to mess with my vision of the church for a long time. She said, isn't that the way that the church is supposed to be at home in the world? We are just the people who defy the social convention to be a little bit distinct, a little bit unique. We're going to be the ones who say, we don't have to produce all the time. This is God's world. We're going to live like it. It might defy social convention, but we're willing to be weird enough to maintain our witness to the world. This is God's world. This is God's world. You don't have to live like it's Baal's world. It's not. Friends, there are beautiful gifts that God is giving us. And I don't know if you see it or not, but we're sitting in the middle of a bunch of new creation stuff around here these days. And what I see is a group of people who are being formed, Trevecca Community Church, to show the world whose world we're really living in. What I see when I look around Trevecca Community Church these days is a group of people who are starting to see how the world really is. But I don't want to lose that because we've resisted the resistance. I want us to live deeply into the practices. I want us to have a holy vision that might make us a little bit odd, a little bit distinct. It might defy social convention. But maybe Amos doesn't have to speak to us to say, when did you go wrong? When did you start just resisting this practice that is designed to make you who you are? That's the vision that I see around the church these days. It's the good news of the gospel, that we can live according to the patterns of the cross, and that on this Palm Sunday, we can walk over these next 7 days into Holy Friday, or Holy Saturday, Good Friday, with the conviction this is God's world, and the way of Jesus Christ really is making the world new. Thanks be to God.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can join us in person in the sanctuary at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings, live on YouTube, or through our sermon podcast. If you'd like to give, you can do so at trevecca.church/give. Any other ministry resources can be found on our website. However you join us, however you choose to engage, know that you are loved. We're grateful for you.